You're going to start the recording?
I am starting the recording, and what I want to do is welcome everyone, and I want to just let you know that at the bottom of your screen, if you're, I don't know how it is on a phone, but if you run your cursor along the bottom, there's a little place that says chat. So if you have a question, if you go to that little chat thing, I'm going to be in charge of paying attention to that while Violet goes through the presentation. And if you have questions, please feel free to put them in there, and at some point we could maybe, you can unmute yourself and ask a question when we get to the question part. And so I'm really happy to have Violet had sort of offered to do this, and I've known Violet for many years, and she's a practitioner with horses and a Feldenkrais practitioner. And she also does Skype calls, and Rebecca, who's on the call from Australia, has used still has her hand up, Rebecca.
How do I take it down?
Yeah, has used done some lessons with Violet in the past. So I'm going to ask everybody at this point, other than Violet, to mute yourselves. And Violet, I'm going to let you take over, and I'll probably mute myself for a while too. So
great.
Welcome.
Thank you. Well, this is so exciting. I've wanted to do something on this for a long time, and the fact that I get to do it now, as I was working on this, it just got more and more exciting. So I'm hoping that this will be exciting for you guys too, and interesting, because there's a lot of interesting information that's not that well known about what we're talking about today. And I will do my best to speak slowly, but if I'm not, please, do something to let me know that I should slow down. And Robin, I've invited Robin as well to provide examples at various points along the way, because of course Robin has decades of amazing experience on all this stuff. Others of you will also have examples and so on. So I'm happy to have people engage in the conversation and so on. There's about 20 slides, just so you know, as I'm going, they're numbered, so you can have some idea of how far we're going. And this is being recorded. And the last 3 slides have resource people on them, resources and links. So I'm not going to talk about those so much, but I will show them on the webinar so that you can go back to them if you want to take a look later to follow up on those. So they're the contact and more information about people that I've used and referenced in this talk. So are we good here? Good to go? I'm going to just make everybody smaller. There we go. Okay. So the talk that I'm doing today is really talking about the biology of when there's too much stress in the body, when things get overwhelming or stuck. And in particular, I want to look at freeze, the freeze state in animals and in humans too, because we're animals. Because freeze is one of the lesser understood states, and it's easy to overlook. And so we'll look at sort of why that is and what's going on behind the scenes, so that when we're working with animals, when we're doing T-touch with animals and with people, we can have a bit better sense of what might be happening inside their body physiologically, because that might help us understand what's going on in their behavior or in what they're showing us or what's showing up there. Alrighty. Can everybody see slide 2? Robin, can you see it? Thumbs up?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Okay. So in Tellington Touch, we often talk about the 5 Fs, or the 5 different ways in which we look for whether an animal may be concerned about what's going on. And these are the fight response, the flight response. So fight is staying and doing something about it. Flight is get the heck out of here as fast as I can. Fidget or fool around, which is where you see an animal kind of doing anything but what you want them to do, or they can't sit still, or those kinds of things, something where they just have to do something. Freeze, which we're going to talk about today, which is kind of getting frozen or kind of like numbed out, kind of dull and numb and not really present as they normally might be. And faint. So those are the 5 that we talk about. And today we're going to focus on the freeze. The faint is one of the aspects of freeze. It's a deep freeze. But we're going to focus on freeze, but we're going to talk about it as one of the protective responses, one of the responses our body might go into in response to experience of threat or danger. And as I mentioned before, freeze is often not noticed or it's misinterpreted. So we might say, oh, that animal's being lazy or resistant or stubborn, or they don't want to do what I'm saying. They're bad. They're just being bad. Or we may have it show up like, everything was just fine. There I was having a nice ride. Everything was perfectly calm and it's all fine. All of a sudden my horse bucked. I have no idea where that came from. Or all of a sudden the dog bit me, or, bit my little kid or somebody else, those kinds of things where we didn't see it coming. And then all of a sudden something big happens. And so that often indicates that there's something in the nervous system where the animal was really concerned, but they weren't showing it in the way that we picked up their signals. And so I want to look at that a bit. So basically, when is that kind of calm thing that we thought was there not really calm? You can look at the picture. I know I looked up, online, pictures of cute smiling dogs. So there's this whole pages and pages of these kinds of pictures. Oh, isn't he cute? He's smiling, right? And, for any of us that kind of know this stuff, we look at that and go, oh, dear. That's not a happy dog. Or a horse, that who's here. You've got someone in the trailer trying to pull, somebody on either side trying to get him in, and the horse is planted. It's not that they're calmly standing outside that thing. They're in a freeze. Their body is kind of stuck. And this kind of calm, what looks like it's sort of calm, is a numbing of normal responses to the world. So things start to shut down. You get a different kind of reaction going than they might if they were calm. If they were truly at ease, they'd do something, and right now they're doing something else. And this is a strategy that's inside the body that's run by the nervous system to take care of a situation, trying to cope with something that's really stressful. And in particular, when they can't take action. So if they're in a situation where they normally would take action if they could, but they're not able to. So they'll go into something that shuts down. And the really key thing for us is that this is not a behavioral choice. This is not, I don't feel like doing that today. I'm just going to be a bad horse and just stand here. Or, something like that. But it's a physiological change inside their body. Their whole nervous system is doing something different than it would be doing if it was calm and relaxed. We're going to find out what that is. How am I doing so far for speed and all that for speaking?
I think it's pretty good. Yeah.
Okay.
If anyone needs her to slow down, just go down to the chat box or put your hand up or something like that, and then I'll pay attention to you.
Okay. So I added this slide in a few days ago because I thought, okay, I need to give a little bit of background about the nervous system so that you understand where freeze is in the spectrum of things. So this is a little bit of biology background, physiology background here. So our nervous systems are generally made up of two big branches or divisions. One is the voluntary nervous system, which is, I'm going to reach for a cup and pick something up. I'm going to walk. I'm going to make a voluntary choice to do something. And then there's the autonomic nervous system. And that's the nervous system that takes care of things that are running in the background. So this is like your heart beating, your breathing happening, your digestion, all those things that happen as part of keeping you alive and ticking. You can have some influence over a lot of the autonomic nervous system pieces, but if you're not paying attention, they'll run anyways. And inside the autonomic nervous system, in that one that's kind of running in the background, there's two main branches. And one is the sympathetic nervous system, which basically revs things up. And the other one is the parasympathetic nervous system, which basically calms things down. And the sympathetic nervous system is most often thought to be, it's talked about as being associated with when you need to take action, you need to do something that's beyond just kind of hanging out, eating, sleeping, doing those things. You have to sort of get into gear. And it can be a fight or flight response. So if there's a threat that shows up, it shows up as fight or flight. And the parasympathetic is what's running the show when things are kind of normal and you're at ease. And in mammals, Stephen Porges, so he's one of the researchers that we're looking at, he started to notice that in mammals in particular, there are two parts of this parasympathetic nervous system. And this is where it gets interesting, because the Tellington Touch stuff really taps into one part of this more than the other, and really focuses on helping animals find the one part that's the more at ease part. So there's one part in here that's the freeze. So that's the oldest branch of the parasympathetic nervous system, and that's a branch that lots of other vertebrates have. So reptiles have it, birds have it, fish have it, like lots of different vertebrates have it. And then there's a system that's with the more advanced, developed with the more advanced brain functions, and it's called the rest, and it supports healthy resting, eating, regeneration, growth, all those kinds of things. And it's also tied in with our social engagement. So with speech, with facial expression, with voice tone, with those things. They're linked together inside mammals. So, and this rest and digest part has its own neural circuits, separate from the freeze process, different kinds of nerves that are over here, the way that have myelin around them, these nerves don't, and they connect to different parts of the brain. So they really are different kinds of responses in the body. So in mammals, in particular, we have 3 different response options. In other animals, there tends to be 2 response options. So the arousal, the sympathetic, and then the parasympathetic is kind of all put together, and it's a lowered state or a higher state, right? So in mammals, like in animals other than mammals, there tends to be an up and a down. So you either get aroused or you get calmed down, and usually their systems want to run somewhere in the middle so they don't get too worn out or too low and die. And in mammals, we have this situation where it's kind of like a bridge. This is a bridge in San Francisco, the Golden Gate Park. So it's a Japanese bridge. It was such a great bridge. I wanted to use it for this. And in us, and most of the animals that we deal with, there's over 5,000 different kinds of mammals. Most of the companion animals that we deal with are mammals. Horses, ungulates are mammals. Many, many animals that we deal with are mammals. And in mammals, there's the sympathetic nervous system, which is the one that when you want to take action and get going, it kicks in. But then it depends on how you calm down as to what system you go into. So a mammal might end up back in rest and digest, which is the more recently developed, in terms of evolution, more recently developed neural system, and it's more complex. It can think, it can decide, I need a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that. I can make choices about, do I get excited right now? No, it's fine. Everything's fine. Oh, now I get a bit excited, but not too much. So there's all this complex thinking that can happen over here, and social engagement. That's where horses will kind of nip at each other and move their bodies and jostle, and people will talk, animals will talk, will use voices, those kinds of things. But over on the freeze side, this is governed by an older, more primitive link to the older brain. This side is managed by the dorsal vagus nerve. This one by the ventral vagus nerve. And this one over here has a lot, it's less complex. It's more just a response. It's a reaction. It's a reflex. So these 2 systems, the sympathetic and the old brain freeze part, are kind of responses. When there's a threat, your body just gets busy and does something. This one has a bit more chance to think about things, intervene, decide what to do. So when you got time to do this is what your body will choose to do, or animal's body will choose to do. But when the nervous system determines that you need action now, this will often shut down. The rest and digest will shut down, and they'll go into arousal, or here we go, into here or here, which are older, more reflexive kinds of systems. Less thinking, more action, more just doing, and less engagement. So what the freeze state does, when you get into that older brain reflexive state, it basically creates a kind of physiological shutdown. Its job is, if you can't get away through fight and flight, You go to an even older protective response, which is basically shut down the nervous system, depress all your body systems so you can conserve energy. And in its most extreme form, you'll get into faint, basically collapse, looking like you're almost dead. And it's an involuntary coping strategy. So it's your body doing this in a passive defense system. And a key thing here is that when you get in this state, thinking stops. So you don't have a thinking animal anymore. You don't have a really responsive thinking person. You have a different kind of animal or person with you right now. And it will kick in as a last resort. And kinds of situations would be, when you feel you're cornered and you can't get away. So for example, the horse, where'd you go? There, this one, this horse is probably feeling kind of in a corner, can't get away, not sure what to do, right? So you get that kind of, now they go into freeze. Now it's an older system and their body's trying to figure out what the heck do I do? And horses have fainted being trailered because they really can't figure it out and they get so depressed. So their systems get so suppressed that they faint. If an animal gets attacked, I've got some photos of this coming up. It all ends well, so just know that. Or if you're feeling trapped, like a puppy or a dog in a shelter, you might see them where it's really loud and noisy, and they're sitting with their nose in the corner. They're just trying to block sensation as much as they can and kind of just deal with the situation, but they're overwhelmed. And people will get this during fireworks as well. And learned helplessness as well. So this can be a training process where you're training an animal to go into shutdown as their response for dealing with things, right? Like, some people want to train for, what's it called? Where you're not feeling. Desensitization, there we go, right? Because it will give compliance. But it's different if the compliance is coming because they're going into a freeze state and they're just trying to numb it out, compared to if compliance is coming because you have a thinking animal who is assessing the risk and assessing the situation and figuring out how to be present without freaking out. Those are two very different kinds of situations. How are we doing so far?
Good, good.
Yep. Alrighty. So a key thing for us that we know from the Tellington Touch work, which is really important to remember, especially when you've got an animal who seems not to be responsive or responding or not with you, is that only when an animal feels safe can learning actually happen. When their nervous system feels safe. So you might decide the environment is safe. You can see no reason why the animal would be concerned. But if the animal does not feel safe for some reason, then they will be in a state where their learning is really compromised, where they can't be open to learning. Robin talks about, when your slots are full in the brain, when you've got so many slots open for learning, and when the slots are full, learning stops. Fear or being in freeze or fight or flight, either of those two responses of your nervous system to a threat or survival responses, and they're busy. They're not open for learning at that point. So it's really important to look at what the animal or the person you're working with is showing you and try to figure out whether they actually feel safe or not, because that can tell you a lot about how they're responding, what's going on. Alrighty. So in freeze, the body is in a survival mode. It's not in a thinking mode. It's not in a learning mode. It's not in those other things. It's gone into one of its two primary survival modes. And it's actually the deeper, older primary survival mode. It's the default when nothing else is working, they'll go into freeze. So which makes it even less open for intervention and for being able to access them in their normal way or in their learning state than fight or flight might be. But we have lots of ways, I talk a little bit later in Tellington Touch, to help bring them from this place over to the place where they can learn, where they're open for learning. But when they're in freeze, they're busy. And this is a really useful and old biological process. Stress is a really useful thing. Stress is something that galvanizes us into action. It helps us take action. It helps us respond to things in our environment. And that's really useful. That's good. When we want to play, when we want to, when animals want to mate, when they want to go look for food, when they want to or need to respond to something that's going on, they take action. And you need a certain amount of stress in your environment to take the action. And also freeze is a really old process that's been around in, developmentally through species. It's been around since way back. It's the oldest response system there is to threat. So it's useful. Obviously, it's useful because it's stuck around. It's still here and it's in our development. But the key thing is that stress is meant to be a temporary thing. So if stress happens and you've got sort of something shows up, there's a threat, and then you get to run, or you get to collapse and then run, or you get to do something about it, and then you get to go back to the herd and go graze and do all sorts of normal things again. That's how stress is meant to happen, and how our bodies are designed to actually deal with it. And where we get in trouble, where animals get in trouble and where humans get in trouble, is when we are under too much stress or it lasts for too long. So too much stress, an example of that would be in first aid. First aiders and first responders are taught you have to treat someone for stress or for shock. Because if a system is shocked, if a body is shocked after an injury or after even a psychological shock, those kinds of things, the blood pressure can go so low, the heart rate can go so low that can kill a person or an animal. So it's the shock itself that becomes the threat, as much as or even more than the injury itself or the initial thing that happened. That's in a sort of an acute situation. And then in a chronic situation, if a person or an animal stays in a highly stressed state, so either in fight or flight or freeze for too long, then all sorts of stuff gets compromised in the body. So the immune system gets run down. The digestion doesn't work the way it's meant to. Circulation doesn't work, and breathing are affected by it. And so you can have health problems that show up as a result of having too much stress in the body that stays there for too long and sort of suppresses the normal things that should be going on in order to stay healthy and rested and doing things well. Alrighty. So some signs of this. So fight or flight is energy intensive. It takes a lot of effort to run away. It takes a lot of effort to fight, to do those big actions. So the freeze, on the other hand, is the response that subdues everything. That basically is an energy conservation response to stress. And so that's the kind of behaviors that you're going to start seeing, or signs that show up. So here's some typical signs of what you might start seeing. So the biological processes in the body slow down. So digestion might slow down. Respiration becomes more shallow. Circulation isn't as robust as it otherwise might be. An animal may not want to eat. Robin, you mentioned that there was a Mustang you were working with where this was one of the things that you would note to notice that the Mustang had just shifted from being okay to being not okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, she did not look like she was not okay. And I was thinking about this as you were talking about two horses in particular. One was a Brumby in Australia who they took into an expo show at the Equitana there, and he'd never been inside. He's a stallion, never been inside, and two good clinicians took him, and they did all sorts of things. The horse had never been ridden, and they ended up standing on his back and cracking their whip and so on and so forth. And they said, no, he wasn't in freeze. He looked just totally fine. But it took her 6 months to actually backtrack to get him back to where he was before she took him to the show, because he totally was, he had just completely shut down in the, sort of in the situation when it was just using compliance. And the hard part is you can get a lot of stuff done, and so people do it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually learning in the situation.
Yeah. And so even like this goat laying here, this is a goat that was in a shelter and looks okay, but the eyes are kind of, like the eyes would look kind of dull in an animal or might be glazed over. And also the sensations and the responses are all flattened out. So depression, we talk about animals being depressed or people being depressed. Sort of depression is classic signs of a freeze situation where everything's just kind of dampened down. There is not much emotion. There's not much expression. There's not much animation. They're just kind of going through the motions, right? And the animal or the person may not move well or may not talk well. So you may have run into situations yourself where you've been shocked, or you run into someone else who's been shocked and they can't string a sentence together. They can't get words out that makes sense. And an animal may not be able to move well. They may be kind of uncoordinated or really, really stuck. And they may seem lazy or be, the person says, oh, my horse is just lazy when he gets into, he goes to the fair and he just gets totally lazy. What's wrong? Right? Those kinds of things. And at this point, it really is a situation where learning has slowed down or pretty well stopped. So here is the most amazing sequence. So freeze can be acute and extreme. And this is from a video sequence that was online. I've just picked the kind of crappy photos, but you get the idea. I had to pick frames from the video. But this is this crazy sequence where we have these gazelles out grazing wherever they're grazing, and a cheetah shows up. And the cheetah chases the gazelle, catches the gazelle, downs the gazelle. The gazelle looks dead. For all intents and purposes, this cheetah has dragged this gazelle along the ground. It looks like dead weight. Then as the cheetah's just about to kill the gazelle and start eating, some hyenas show up. They chase off the cheetah. The hyenas are over at the gazelle, but then the gazelle starts to circle back. So now the hyenas get up and they move a little bit away, and all of a sudden the gazelle leaps up and runs away and gets away. It's like everybody's cheering at that point. Like, yes! Yay! The happy ending for the gazelle. But it's an incredible piece of footage to show the potential movement between fight, flight, freeze, because this is, the faint and the collapse is a deep freeze. It's your whole body system collapses so you actually don't feel anything. If you're going to be killed by a cheetah, let's not feel it, right? Let's not notice it. And then leaping back into fight or flight to be able to get back over to the place where they can go into grazing. They can get back to normal as a gazelle, as a part of a pack. It's totally, I didn't add the link for this, but if you look up cheetah, gazelle, hyenas, you'll find it. So that's the more obvious kind of fight, flight, and freeze that we might think of. But the less obvious one, and the one that's really important to look for, is the freeze state that's chronic, or that's become what's called a functional freeze. And there's a lot of humans that walk around in a functional freeze, and there's a lot of animals who walk around in a functional freeze. And in this situation, you'll have an animal or person who's going through the motions, like they're getting things done. They're able to function in life. They can eat, they can go out, they can work. Animals can go for their walk. They can be ridden. They can do their jobs. And they're looking kind of stoic and calm and all those kinds of things. But actually, their inner physiology continues to be in the soup of stress chemicals. So in this case, it's a dog who's looking out the window, maybe looking, sad because his owner is away or owner has gone, or he's, who knows what's going on. We may, I've had a horse who became depressed after the girl who used to ride him all the time went off to university, and the horse didn't know what had happened, right? And so then the horse became depressed about this, and there was a way to bring it out of it, but we could tell there was something wrong. Robin, do you have some examples of sort of what you've seen in relation? Yeah, like the horse would have been in this kind of suppressed state after being in that demo, probably would have been back at home, a very different kind of animal for 6 months, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Animals lose their best friend or those kinds of things. You'll see a change in what's going on, and they'll look quiet and subdued, but they may not be fine. And so what happens, why this matters is because just like if you're chronically overstimulated and in that overstimulated stress soup, if you're in the freeze stress soup inside your physiology, that takes a toll. And we're used to looking for and noticing more active behaviors that would show a problem, like barking or horses that are cribbing and so on. But if the horse is looking fine and not being a problem, you may not see it. So it's one of those things just to look at and to look for.
Violet, Rebecca has an example of that. So do you want to just share that?
Please.
Can you unmute yourself?
Myself?
Yes. There you go. Okay.
Yay!
Yay!
Very good. I've got an example of that exact thing. I've got a racehorse, an ex-racehorse that came to me in July last year. I would say he is what I would call highly institutionalized. Used to things happening at certain times. But since he's retired, he has had 3 or 4 very serious health issues. And I think that's exactly what it is for him, Violet. I think that he was coping in that environment. And since he's come out, he's had peritonitis, he's had low choke, he's had a massive worm burden. And the most recent one was that all of those things created so much stress in his digestion that despite me feeding 4 times what I'm feeding the other horses, he has dropped weight to the point where I thought his organs might shut down, like he's almost starved himself to death.
Wow.
So we're moving through that again. I've changed a lot of things for him, but I would say that's exactly what was going on for him. And I see it a lot when I'm in the racing stables, the different way the horses react. And I would never have picked him as one that was in a freeze state.
Wow.
It's so interesting, eh? Like, it's just, yeah. And it could be that, being out of his regulated environment just added one more layer of stuff
Totally. I think he was quite anxious about all the changes. There was changes to his feed routine, his exercise routine, where he was living. And then when he went into the herd, he'd never been in with other horses since he was weaned.
Right.
So that adds another layer of stress, just trying to understand what the hell they're talking about.
Yeah.
The other herd members. So, yeah.
Yes, I mean, it could be that it's something where we think we're doing something great for the animal, and they should feel safe, and they're loved, they're cared for, all those good things. But somehow they're telling us that it's still really, really difficult for them. There's something really hard about this.
Totally. Yeah. Okay, I shall mute myself again.
No, that was so good. That was a perfect example. Yeah. So the way out of freeze. So what's really, really great, and as I've done more work getting training in how to work with trauma that sits in the body, and through my Feldenkrais work and through the other stuff, it all echoes what we already do in Tellington Touch. Tellington Touch works in the way that the physiology can most easily find its way from its stress state back to a calmer state that's more the rest and digest kind of state. Because the way that works best, that's being shown over and over and over again to work best, is that if you take really small steps, you allow the animal or the person you're working with to test whether those steps feel safe inside their own self and whether they work for them. And if the animal has choice to go into it, come back, those kinds of things, and they can be successful in those little steps, then the physiology can gradually start to shift over to something new and different. If the steps are too big, if we take them from, and then sort of create this fabulous experience, the steps may be too big, and the experience of that huge shift may be overwhelming all over again. So what they get from it is, oh, that was overwhelming, and now I'm back in freeze, right? So that it wasn't something that caught them and worked for them. But if you have the small successful steps, you have the pauses in between so the nervous system can actually notice whether this was okay, and you let the animal or the person sense for themselves whether they are in fact safe, and whether this was a reasonable thing, and whether maybe it is useful. Those are the things the nervous system loves to know. The body needs to check that out. If those things are happening, then it's okay to take the step in the direction of a new behavior or a new way of doing things.
Yeah,
So
can I actually add something about this? Because you see it sometimes, you'll see a mild sort of forms of freeze, for instance, when you add something new, like when you put a body wrap on, when I do the beeline with animals, especially animals who have always been put on a command, not dissimilar to the racehorse situation, where if they've had lots and lots of obedience training and they do anything as long as they're told what to do, but they have never really been given an opportunity to make choices. And when you can do those little steps, we had a dog at a shelter in Cape Town that had to be carried into the room or the area that we were working because she couldn't go on a leash, and she was completely in freeze. She was on the put to sleep list because they couldn't see any point in keeping her. She just wouldn't engage with anybody. And so we brought her for an hour session, and in that hour, I don't know, maybe they did 10 or 15 minutes of a minute here, maybe doing a little touch and then stopping before anything happened, before she had any response, and a body wrap for a minute, just the tiniest bit. And we thought, well, at least we gave her a nice experience for that sort of last day. And the next morning, she didn't go on a leash at all. And the next morning, the person that worked at the shelter who had brought her, she came a little bit late to the course. She came in with the same dog on a leash. She trotted in and up the stairs and laid down beside her like she had been there every day. And
no way.
And she got adopted,
Wow.
Of course. And but it was amazing because I would have bet money that wouldn't have happened. But I think it was that you don't have to see. I think we sometimes think we have to see a change in the moment. And the best thing to me is when you do a little bit without having attachment to outcome, without having attachment to, I need to make this happen now. And that's, it was amazing. She's got a great home, and it's a wonderful situation, but she was definitely freeze. And the other thing that you see with some animals is, if they've had a lot of freeze and you push them too much, the freeze goes into fight or flight, usually into fight if they feel like they're trapped. So I think that's another reason to be really mindful in terms of how we work in small steps and give lots of pauses.
Yeah, and I think you've talked as well about dogs coming into the dog clinics and allowing them just to come a little bit. They might come, move from the chair just to put their nose in the center of the circle and then back out again. And then, a step or two here and then back out again. And that whole experience, horse is the same, being able to move into a situation and back out again, going in and out of the trailer. That sense of being able to take the small enough step, move back out again. Mm-hmm. That's being shown in lots of other places, like Peter Levine in somatic experiencing, Kathy Kane in her somatic practice work. All those say that ability to go and return and choose your own ability, your timing for how much you can take and when to come out is so key to this as well. So key to being able to create that sense of safety and the ability to integrate and possibly sense that something is safe and you could do a little more of it.
Yeah, so. Choice.
The choice part, yeah, that total choice and the movement in and out. So Peter Levine calls it pendulation in his work, being able to swing in, swing out, but not too big, right? You don't want to get the response where they're all worried again, because then they remember that about the experience. So stop before that happens, which is what you were mentioning with that dog. Yeah. So here's a couple of things. There's a couple of things that are really, really interesting about freeze and about coming out of freeze. And they're really helpful to know about if you're going to help, as you're working with an animal or with a person to come out of freeze. First is that the path out of freeze is not predictable. Often freeze may go through a fight or flight, so it may get very activated. So a person or a dog may come out of or a horse may come out of being kind of very compliant, very, not much of anything, and suddenly get really active or really fight or flight. And I remember one of the clinics we had clinic at your place, Robin, where one of the horses, it was about a 3-day stint. This horse was invited to come out of freeze. And then Britt came, the vet came to do some, acupressure and some other stuff. And the first day, the horse would have none of it. Suddenly, this very compliant horse was all attitude and all opinions about everything and just was expressing totally. And she was very, very active and was really agitated about a lot of things. And then a couple of days later, Britt came back again, and the horse was much more accepting, but it was, thinking, accepting. I was like, okay, I'll let you do that. I was sort of a partner in the process of it, but it was sort of a process of coming through, and this horse was first really active, and everybody's going, whoa, who knew?
Yeah, absolutely.
And this may, and sometimes they may just, the freeze may come off, and they're in a different state. It's kind of like the dog that you were working there. You didn't necessarily see a really agitated state. Next day, the dog came in and was much more sort of socially engaged, able to process information, able to think, those kinds of things. So you never know how it's going to work, and it may change from day to day. The second thing is really useful to know. This is something that Peter Levine studied a lot when he was first, he developed his somatic experiencing work out of this, is that if stress has been stuck in the body for a period of time and you haven't been able to take care of the situation, so you were in a situation, an animal was in a situation where they couldn't do what they wanted to do. So one of the examples they use, Peter Levine's work uses, is a polar bear who's been tranquilized so they can weigh and measure and do whatever they have to do with the polar bear as part of a research process. That animal would have preferred to run, would have preferred to get away, would have preferred to snarl, bite, do whatever, and get out of the situation, but they weren't able to. They were tranquilized, they collapsed, and then the measurements were done. In this case, when the animal was coming out of that freeze, the polar bear starts to shake, and it's a big shaking that happens. So like the whole body is shaking. And it's quite a large shaking thing. And Peter Levine talks about this as being a discharge of that stress energy that was stuck in the body. The energy where the bear wanted to do something and couldn't. And in this bear, you actually see the feet kind of doing a little bit of moving back and forth, and you see the lips curling a bit into a snarl, and you see the body shaking. And it's like the animal is going through the motions it wanted to do and couldn't. And then after about a minute or so of this, the shaking stops, and the bear kind of wakes up out of it and is able to stand up and go off. And I had this happen with a dog of ours. And this was before I knew about this stuff. I brought her back from being spayed, and she had never been inside, wasn't an inside dog, didn't like people she didn't know, had gone to the vet, had been spayed, came home. She was just laying there really quietly on the ground, kind of like, oh my God, what happened? And then she started to do the shaking thing. I thought, oh, what's this, right? I phoned up the vet. The vet said, well, maybe it was an allergic reaction. I don't know. Just sit with her and keep her safe, right? So I did that. And after about a minute or so of the shaking, she stopped. And it's like she woke up and she kind of looked around. It was like, oh, so she saw she was home. And she kind of went into her doghouse and she just kind of sat there looking kind of hungover. But, basically back. She was back. Whereas before she'd been kind of like in a shock state.
And I think actually it happens when animals come out of seizures. And actually Janet probably has something more to say about that. But when an animal comes out of a seizure, and they'll often like take off running around, or also be really hungry, or they'll, depending on, on the animal.
Yeah, Janet, do you have anything to add to that? Because it is something that shows up, and it will show up in shock with people as well, where people will start to shake, and it's not necessarily a cold. They're not cold.
Right.
There's this shaking that happens, and it's actually a useful thing to allow to have happen, rather than feeling like you have to stop it, right? Like it has a useful function. And you might also get it, like I get it in my Feldenkrais work when I'm working with someone, their leg may start to shake, or something may start to happen, and I ask them, are we okay with this? And they go, yeah, that's okay. I said, okay, this is interesting. It could be your body just shaking off some of this stress that's been sitting in here. Now it gets a chance to move through and go on, right? So it sort of depends on what's going on.
Do you have anything to add, Janet?
Yeah, it opened up a different perspective for me like the seizures and why they do that. Yeah.
Cool.
But I do see that in coming out of anesthesia too.
For sure. For sure. For people too.
Yeah, it's very common coming out of anesthesia, because in anesthesia, you're helpless and your nervous system hates being helpless. Right? So it's one of those things where if the body notices it's helpless, it's a big event for your body. And so there can be that release that comes afterwards then. Yeah. There you are.
It's resting on my dog.
Oh, I see. I saw the top of your head before. Now I see you. This is great. Anyone else want to jump in here, or should I keep going?
I think you can keep going.
Alrighty. So I talked about this a bit before, but if you invite an animal to express their views instead of staying in freeze, they may have a lot to say. You know, so suddenly your horse this was another horse that we had in a clinic with you, Robin, a horse that used to be really compliant and do everything. Suddenly just, started to let their owner know, you know what? That saddle pisses me off, right? Or when you come at me with that saddle, I have things to say about it. If you put it on my back, I'm going to jump around. Like there's a sense of, I've got things to say and I'm going to say them now because you said I could.
Yeah, absolutely. When they have somebody that will listen, sometimes there is really the sense that they have a lot to say, and it's that whole ability to find a neutral way of dealing with them so that you're not obviously in the way, you're not in any sort of danger, but you're just neutral in the response to them, and you change what's creating that concern.
Yes. Yeah, and you may notice that situations that they dealt with before, that they sort of put up with before, like a dog. They let people run up to them and smooch them and go, aren't you cute? And hug them in their face and all those things. But now they won't. They won't do it without letting you know that this is not something they're comfortable with.
Well, and we talked about this in a workshop that Debbie and I were doing about socialization. And you see this a lot with people who they think they're doing their dog a favor by socializing them, but actually they're not giving them the choice whether they interact or not. And so those dogs may put up with it for a while, and some of those dogs go into this sort of state of kind of high arousal that some people think is really happy. And then there's other dogs that go into, they start growling or they start to vocalize in a different way. And it has everything to do with the fact that they really haven't had, they've been pushed into socialization as opposed to being offered options of having social experiences.
Yeah, and so instead of being able to engage in that thinking way, they're being pushed in where their arousal or their freeze state has been activated, and they're just trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah, well, and you see it in puppies where that people pass the puppy and they pass them around from person to person. And, some dogs are fine with it and some dogs are not fine with it, but some are fine by they just go into a kind of mild freeze, or they go into, fool around, which is a kind of flight that they can't get away from. But that's why with puppies, I like to really encourage people to have puppies' feet on the ground and not be constantly picking them up.
Perfect. Yeah. So through the Teach Touch work that we all do, we do have lots of ways to sort of help animals figure something out with us and us to figure it out with them, right? And find, as you said, Robin, sort of a neutral, patient, intelligent way to find a new way of doing things. If they're coming out of a state that they have been in for a long time, what do they do instead? Helping them learn that and allowing them time to find out, does that feel okay? Does that feel safe inside the animal? Would they choose to be here? And then how do you work with a thinking animal? It's very different to have a thinking animal than to have a compliant animal who's just sort of going through the paces. So it's that whole invitation to work differently and all the tools that we have to be able to do that. So here you go, a few pictures of rest and digest in action or non-action. These are two cats. So when these two cats met, this brown one literally tore the scruff off of this white one. He would chase this white one anywhere in the house and fur flying, for about 10 days. Then they had catnip together, and now they're best.
Great.
So, you know, it's sort of, it can go from one to the other in there. And this is, you know, horses or animals out doing the rest and digesting in a fairly natural state there. So I'm just going to go through the 3 resource slides so that they're on the webinar, but I'd be happy to have people's comments, questions, anything. The resource slides here, Irene Lyon is a colleague of mine. She does Feldenkrais and somatic experiencing and has developed great online resources to talk about fight, flight, and freeze in people. So it's really, really easy to understand, good science, all that kind of stuff in there. Dr. Stephen Porges is the one who developed the polyvagal theory and has done a lot to bring information about social engagement and the nervous system and what's going on. What's the difference between a sort of a thinking, healthy, at ease parasympathetic response versus the freeze parasympathetic response. He was the one that really found that and has brought it forward. Again, given one link to an article, plus he's got lots of good interviews online and other stuff online. Peter Levine with the somatic experiencing, he's the one that really developed looking at what freeze is in animals, how animals come out of freeze, and what happens when freeze gets stuck. If you don't get a chance to complete taking care of yourself and complete the action, what does it show up as? And he noticed the shaking in animals when they came out of freeze as a discharge of that nervous, that stress energy. And he also developed the idea of pendulation. You know, do a little bit, come back, do a little bit, come back. Bessel van der Kolk put out a great book a couple of years ago on the effects of trauma in the body, and also some research. So he's a medical researcher. Some of the science that had been found at that time about what kinds of things seem to make a difference, seem to help with getting trauma out of the body. Gabor Mate had another book. He was the first one to really have a book out that talked about the cost of stress and the connection between stress and disease, if stress is stuck in the body and can't get out. And then Kathy Kane is an American who does some remarkable teaching. She's really, really interesting to take programs with, of how do you work with touch to be able to access trauma that's sitting in the body. What does it feel like? How do you help move it? How do you help it release? So this is in people, but it's interesting to see what she's found over 40 years of practice that works, and what it looks like, and how it might show up, and all those kinds of things. So really, really interesting stuff. So I just wanted to provide those people in case any of you want to look more.
Yeah, interesting. And I did not realize that I don't think of freeze as being, you think of it as being the sympathetic, not parasympathetic, but it makes sense when you talk about the sort of how primitive it is, and the, sort of the bridge between the two, because freeze isn't always a bad thing especially momentarily. If you have a dog that is, always sort of full on, and then they kind of go into freeze before they come into something else. And I don't mean freeze before they are, before a dog bites or kind of whatever, but just like sometimes you put a wrap on and it's like suddenly, as Moshe Feldenkrais would say, you have the attention of the nervous system.
Yes.
And I think that that's where it's kind of finding that balance of not, as you say, not leaving them there very long, because any type of learning that takes place is stressful. Any change in the body is a certain amount of stress. So it's making sure that there has to be stress in order to learn. None of us like to change, and it's a little bit difficult for us, but it is that whole thing of not leaving them there for very long.
Yeah. And allowing a bit of stimulation and then backing off from it so that the nervous system can process and decide, was that okay?
Yeah. So
right?
Does those of you who are still on, do any of you have any either questions or comments? If you can think of something, I know sometimes you get in a mode of listening, and it's kind of hard to change that hats, but if either any questions you have, or either type them in, or if you don't want to talk, or into the chat below, or you can unmute yourself and ask the questions. and from Jill. Perfect. So Jill said that it's perfectly timed. This morning, she worked with a dog that is petrified going up the steps in his house, and this is so helpful. And that is actually my dog Roy. I think it's actually in the dog book, but when we got him, we realized he'd never lived in a house, but we didn't really realize that he couldn't do steps because we have open steps in our house. But he couldn't do a closed step. And so one day I took him to the bottom of the step. I had a wrap on him, and I just gave him a little bit of food on the bottom of the step, and he put one foot on the step, and then I said, oh, that's enough. And for him, within an hour, he was going up and down the steps on his own. And it was it was, again, such a great lesson that if we can give them a taste of something or a taste of possibility, but with complete choice, that they can go, that they can do things. And that's why we chunk it down into, and with all of the elements that we use in the groundwork. So thanks, Jill. And Elizabeth said, I work with a horse who seems to freeze momentarily when I'm offering something. Yeah, I think offering something new. I think that there's some animals that their response to something new is to be more the fight, and you will, in terms of you touch them and they bite you. There's other horses or bite at you. There's other horses that will just sort of freeze, and that's where those moments of if people could just pause when animals do something and just give them a moment, keep yourself safe, don't react to it. It's amazing how quickly they can recover from that. And
as
go ahead.
something related to that, I think if we stay in the calm state, this is a whole other talk, but that whole mirroring of our state, like if they notice that we're not worried, then it becomes easier for them to come back again.
Yeah, it's that whole thing is, are you part of the problem or are you part of the solution? And if you're in a state of meeting them in an aroused state, it's not really very helpful.
Well,
So,
when I work with that horse, who's quite nervous and distracted, he's the one I spoke about on my Facebook page about being the subject of that ethical dilemma I had, because I learned his trainer, who seems like the most decent, loving guy. He loves the horse, and yet, I've heard these stories about how he uses his whip quite liberally. I've been trying to, I specifically transmit, the Tellington Touch philosophy, my own personal philosophy, and so he's there when I react to that, and I always react very calmly. I always speak to the horse. I always check in with the horse if I see any kind of resistance. I just quietly back up. I ask the horse if he's okay. I do something else. I don't go back to that thing. And I try to be an example simultaneously to the trainer to show him my approach. And I take that very seriously. If, that particular look when the horse's face kind of freezes, I figure, okay, that's really we're not ready for that. We'll come back to that another time.
Well, and there's a double-edged sword with that, and Rebecca and I went through this quite a bit in Australia, where there's sometimes if horses are constantly in the habit, you could say, that I do A and they do B, and if we constantly are going back and forth with that if you never gently say, maybe, well, how about this, and just try a little bit more, it's hard for them to move forward. So it's great in the beginning with animals. I just, kind of back off, step, have a little look. And sometimes it's just, they have such a strong habitual response to something that's, anything new, that sometimes just, being there for that little moment and then just say, hey, how about this? So that it's just kind of gently, as Violet was talking about, offer them a little bit and then kind of back away from it, but offer it and then back away, so that it isn't only always the back away, if that makes sense.
No, I agree. I agree. Yeah.
Cool. So if anybody else have any questions, and if you don't, this is perfect timing, Violet, an hour. We like to kind of keep it with that so we can all have the rest of our evening. But I was really fantastic, and I thank you so much. And I will be sending this as a recording to anybody that was signed up for this will get this as a recording tomorrow. So thanks everybody, and enjoy
Great
the rest
stuff,
of your
Violet.
night.
Thank you